Kelly's World Season 1 Review, Episode 4 Conflict, Ideology, and the Reshaping of the Modern World. In the previous episode, we examined how industrialization and imperial expansion reshaped global power, transforming economic systems and creating new patterns of inequality. In this episode, we shift our focus to the consequences of those transformations. Specifically, we will examine how global conflict, rapid industrial expansion, and ideological competition reshaped political systems and the structure of the modern world. We will begin with the decline of major land-based empires, including the Qing and Ottoman empires, and consider how internal weakness and external pressure led to a gradual loss of power. We will then explore how industrialization spread beyond its original centers, focusing on latecomer states such as Russia and Japan, and the role of state-led modernization. From there, we will examine the outbreak of World War I and its transformation into a total war that reshaped societies and political boundaries. Finally, we will consider the Cold War and the process of decolonization, analyzing how ideological rivalry and the collapse of empires contributed to the emergence of new nations and global tensions. Together, these developments represent a major transition in world history, as the forces of industrialization and imperialism gave way to global conflict, ideological competition, and the formation of the modern international system. Lesson 20: Civilizations in Decline. The decline of major land-based empires such as the Qing dynasty and the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century illustrates a broader shift in global power, as industrializing Western nations gained increasing influence over regions that had once been dominant. Importantly, these empires were not immediately colonized, but instead experienced a gradual loss of autonomy through external pressure and internal weakness. One of the key reasons these empires avoided full colonization was the geopolitical context of the time. In both China and the Ottoman Empire, competing European powers had strong interests in the region, but were unwilling to allow any single rival to gain complete control. In China, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and later Japan all sought access to markets and resources. Rather than dividing China outright, they established spheres of influence where each power exercised economic and political control in specific regions. This system allowed foreign powers to benefit from China's economy without the cost of direct administration. A similar dynamic existed in the Ottoman Empire. Although the empire was widely recognized as weakening, its strategic location made it too important to collapse entirely. European powers, particularly Britain and France, often acted to preserve the Ottoman state as a buffer against Russian expansion. This balance of power politics prolonged the empire's existence, even as it steadily lost territory and influence. At the same time, both empires attempted to respond to these challenges through reform efforts. The Ottoman Empire introduced the Tanzimat reforms, which aimed to modernize the military, centralize administration, and create legal equality among subjects. These reforms were modeled in part on European systems and were intended to strengthen the state without fundamentally altering its structure. Similarly, reformers within the Qing dynasty attempted to adopt Western technology and military practices through movements such as the self-strengthening movement. However, these reforms ultimately proved insufficient. In both cases, modernization was imposed from above and focused primarily on strengthening the state rather than transforming society. Traditional social structures remained largely intact, and resistance from conservative elites limited the effectiveness of change. As a result, these empires were unable to fully adapt to the rapidly changing global environment. Another key factor in their decline was the growing technological and organizational gap between these empires and industrialized Western nations. Encounters such as Napoleon's invasion of Egypt demonstrated the effectiveness of modern military organization and technology, exposing the limitations of traditional systems. These defeats were not only military setbacks, but also symbolic of a broader shift in global power. The decline of the Qing and Ottoman empires, therefore, reflects a combination of internal weakness and external pressures. While they were not fully colonized, they were increasingly subject to foreign influence and control. Their experiences highlight the challenges faced by traditional empires in adapting to a world increasingly shaped by industrialization and global competition. Lesson 21: Industrialization outside the West. Industrialization did not occur simultaneously across the globe. While countries such as Britain and France industrialized early, other regions were forced to industrialize later under very different conditions. This process, often referred to as latecomer industrialization, required states to modernize rapidly in order to compete with already industrialized powers. As a result, countries such as Russia and Japan followed distinct paths that relied heavily on state intervention, foreign technology, and accelerated reform. Russia provides an example of a latecomer industrializer that faced significant structural challenges. Unlike Western Europe, Russia lacked a strong capitalist middle class capable of driving industrial growth. Instead, the state took the lead in developing industry, financing railroads, promoting heavy industry, and attracting foreign investment. This top-down approach allowed Russia to industrialize relatively quickly, particularly in sectors such as steel and coal. However, this rapid development created serious social tensions. Industrialization was concentrated in urban areas, leading to overcrowded cities and harsh working conditions. At the same time, the majority of the population remained tied to agriculture, and the legacy of serfdom limited economic mobility. These conditions contributed to growing discontent among workers and peasants, helping to fuel revolutionary movements in the early 20th century. Japan, by contrast, is often seen as a more successful example of latecomer industrialization. Following the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, the Japanese government undertook a comprehensive program of modernization. It actively promoted industrial development by building infrastructure, establishing model factories, and sending students abroad to learn from Western technologies. Unlike Russia, Japan was able to integrate these changes more effectively into its society. A key factor in Japan's success was its willingness to adapt foreign ideas while maintaining political control. The government abolished traditional social structures, such as the samurai class, and implemented reforms in education, taxation, and military organization. Once industries were established, many were transferred to private ownership, contributing to the growth of powerful business groups. By the early 20th century, Japan had not only industrialized, but had also emerged as a major military power, as demonstrated by its victory in the Russo-Japanese War. This success challenged the assumption that industrialization was limited to Western nations, and showed that non-Western societies could compete on a global scale. The experiences of Russia and Japan illustrate the broader dynamics of industrialization outside the West. Latecomer industrialization required rapid adaptation and often depended on strong state involvement. While it could lead to significant economic and military gains, it also introduced new social and political tensions. These contrasting outcomes highlight the complexity of global industrialization and its role in reshaping the balance of power in the modern world. Lesson 22: World War I. World War I was not the result of a single event, but rather the culmination of long-term structural tensions within Europe that made large-scale conflict increasingly likely. By the early 20th century, a combination of nationalism, imperial rivalry, militarism, and alliance systems had created a fragile and highly interconnected political environment in which even a localized crisis could escalate into a global war. Nationalism played a central role in increasing tensions across Europe. In some cases, it fostered unity within nation states, but it also intensified rivalries between them. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Balkans, where nationalist movements challenged the authority of multi-ethnic empires such as Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. These movements created instability and drew in larger powers that sought to protect their interests in the region. Imperial competition further contributed to conflict. European powers had spent the 19th century expanding their influence across Africa and Asia, and this competition for territory and resources increased tensions between rival nations. Although imperial conflicts often occurred outside Europe, they heightened distrust and rivalry among the major powers, contributing to an atmosphere of competition rather than cooperation. Militarism also played a significant role in shaping the path to war. European nations invested heavily in their military forces, developing advanced weapons and maintaining large standing armies. Military planning became increasingly rigid, with detailed mobilization schedules designed to respond quickly to threats. However, this emphasis on preparedness made it difficult to de-escalate crises, as once mobilization began, it was hard to reverse. The alliance system was perhaps the most important factor in transforming a regional conflict into a global war. European powers were divided into two main alliances, each committed to defending its members. While these alliances were intended to maintain balance and deter conflict, they had the opposite effect by ensuring that any conflict involving one nation would likely involve many others. The immediate cause of the war was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in 1914. Austria-Hungary's response to this event set off a chain reaction of alliances and mobilizations. Within a short period, the major powers of Europe were drawn into the conflict, transforming what began as a regional dispute into a global war. World War I demonstrates how interconnected political systems can amplify conflict. It highlights the dangers of rigid alliances, intense nationalism, and militarization, all of which contributed to the outbreak of a war that reshaped the global order and marked the beginning of a new era of conflict in the 20th century. Lesson 23: Revolution, Depression, and Nationalism from 1918 to 1939. The period between World War I and World War II was defined by instability, economic collapse, and the rise of new political ideologies. Rather than creating a lasting peace, World War I and the Treaty of Versailles destabilized Europe and much of the world, setting the stage for further conflict. One of the most important developments of this period was the rise of fascism. Fascism emerged as a reaction to the chaos of the post-war world. In countries like Italy and Germany, many people viewed liberal democracy as weak and ineffective, particularly in the face of economic crisis and social unrest. Fascist leaders such as Mussolini and Hitler promised order, national strength, and unity. They rejected democracy and individual rights in favor of authoritarian control and total loyalty to the state. Importantly, fascism gained support not just from the desperate, but from elites, industrialists, landowners, and members of the middle class, who feared the spread of socialism and communism. At the same time, revolutions and political upheaval reshaped other parts of the world. In Russia, long-standing social and economic tensions combined with the pressures of World War I to produce a full-scale revolution. While earlier unrest had challenged the Tsar, the conditions of 1917 were far more severe, leading to the collapse of the monarchy and the rise of the Bolsheviks. The new Soviet state would pursue rapid industrialization and centralized control, creating a model that would influence global politics for decades. China experienced a different kind of instability. The Treaty of Versailles, which transferred German holdings in China to Japan rather than returning them to Chinese control, sparked outrage and led to the May 4th movement. This movement contributed to the rise of competing political ideologies, particularly nationalism and communism, setting the stage for long-term conflict within China. Overlaying all of these developments was the Great Depression. Beginning in 1929, The global economy collapsed due to structural weaknesses such as overproduction, excessive borrowing, and fragile financial systems. As banks failed and unemployment soared, governments struggled to respond effectively. In many countries, this crisis undermined confidence in democratic systems and increased support for more extreme political solutions. In Germany, the Depression proved particularly devastating, fueling support for the Nazi Party, which promised economic recovery and national revival. In Japan, economic hardship contributed to the rise of militarism, as leaders argued that expansion was necessary to secure resources and stabilize the economy. In contrast, the Soviet Union, largely isolated from the global economy, avoided the worst effects of the Depression, reinforcing the appeal of its system to some observers. Taken together, the interwar period illustrates how economic crisis and political instability can drive the rise of radical ideologies. Rather than resolving the tensions created by World War I, this period intensified them, setting the stage for the global conflict that would follow. Lesson 24: World War II. World War II emerged from the unresolved tensions of the interwar period, as aggressive states took advantage of weak international responses and deep global instability. Rather than a sudden conflict, the war developed through a series of calculated challenges to the existing international order. In Germany, Adolf Hitler systematically dismantled the Treaty of Versailles. Through rearmament, remilitarization, and territorial expansion, the Nazis tested the willingness of other powers to respond. Each success, whether the reoccupation of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, or the seizure of Czechoslovakia, reinforced the perception that the Western democracies lacked the resolve to act. This policy of appeasement, combined with the failure of institutions like the League of Nations, encouraged further aggression, not only from Germany, but also from Italy and Japan. Japan followed a similar pattern in East Asia. Its invasion of Manchuria and later China demonstrated that expansion could proceed with minimal consequences. These actions weakened the international system and made a larger conflict increasingly likely. When war began, Germany and Japan achieved rapid early success. Germany's use of blitzkrieg, fast coordinated attacks using tanks and air power, allowed it to defeat major European powers quickly. Japan similarly relied on speed, planning, and surprise, most notably in its attack on Pearl Harbor. However, these strategies were designed for short-term victories, not prolonged conflict. As the war expanded, the weaknesses of these strategies became clear. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union and declaration of war on the United States stretched its resources beyond sustainable limits. What had begun as a series of rapid campaigns became a global war of attrition, one that Germany's economy could not support. Japan faced similar challenges, lacking the industrial capacity and resources necessary to compete with the United States over time. World War II was also defined by its unprecedented scale and brutality. The Holocaust, the systematic genocide carried out by the Nazi regime, resulted from a combination of long-standing anti-Semitism, racial ideology, and the conditions of total war. The war blurred the line between military and civilian targets, leading to massive destruction and loss of life. The end of the war reshaped the global order. European powers were weakened, while the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. Their competing ideologies, capitalism and communism, would define the Cold War that followed. At the same time, the war accelerated the process of decolonization, as imperial powers lost the ability to maintain control over their territories. World War II therefore represents both the culmination of interwar tensions and the beginning of a new global system. It demonstrated the consequences of unresolved conflict, economic instability, and ideological extremism. while also setting the stage for the political and social transformations of the modern world. Lesson 25: Globalization and the Modern World. The period following World War II was defined by an acceleration of globalization, as economic systems, technological innovation, and political institutions combined to create an increasingly interconnected world. While global connections had existed for centuries, the second half of the 20th century marked a shift towards a truly integrated global system. One of the most important drivers of this transformation was the creation of international economic institutions. In the aftermath of the Great Depression and World War II, leaders sought to build a more stable global economy. Organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and later trade agreements like GATT were designed to reduce trade barriers, stabilize currencies, and promote economic growth. These institutions created the framework for predictable and sustained global economic interaction. At the same time, technological advances dramatically increased the speed and scale of global connections. Innovations such as container shipping, commercial aviation, and later digital communication made it easier and cheaper to move goods, people, and information across long distances. These developments allowed companies to operate on a global scale and contributed to the creation of complex international supply chains. Multinational corporations played a central role in this process. By operating across borders, they connected national economies into a single global system. They sought out lower production costs, new markets, and access to resources, encouraging countries to open their economies to trade and investment. This contributed to economic growth, but also reinforced patterns of inequality between regions. Globalization also had a significant cultural dimension. Ideas, media, and cultural products spread rapidly across borders, creating shared global experiences. While this often reflected the influence of dominant cultures, particularly that of the United States, it also led to cultural exchange and hybridization, as societies adapted and reshaped global influences to fit local contexts. Despite these benefits, globalization introduced new challenges. Economic integration made countries more interdependent, meaning that crises in one region could quickly spread to others. The global economy also became more unequal, as some regions benefited more than others from trade and investment. Environmental consequences became increasingly significant as well. The expansion of industrial production and global trade contributed to rising carbon emissions, resource depletion, and environmental degradation. These challenges were often most severe in regions that had been shaped by earlier patterns of imperialism, where economies remained dependent on resource extraction. Overall, globalization after World War II represents a major transformation in world history. It created a world that is more connected than ever before, but also one marked by new forms of inequality and shared global challenges. Understanding this process is essential for analyzing the modern world and the complex relationships that define it.